The leaves of the tree are for healing.
Shalom, everybody. So recently on my Facebook feed, I've seen some people going back and forth about maritime law versus common law and if we should be, obeying the government and keeping our social security numbers and things like that. And one of my viewers actually sent me this book, which is very, very interesting, The Most Dangerous Superstition. So I wanted to read a little bit about it. And I just sort of wanted to first start this video off explaining that I do know about maritime law versus common law. This playlist that's on the screen, I actually created, and it said last updated in 2016 when I clicked on it today, because I really haven't done much with it. 2016, that's 2 years ago, and I didn't even realize it had been that long, but of course it has, because in 2015 I prayed to no longer be deceived, and I was led to things like this. I believe I've watched every single one of these things, and gosh, this live stream was over 7 hours long. I didn't watch the whole live stream, but I went through a lot, and it says last updated today because there were some videos, of course, that were deleted off of YouTube from people who probably got their account shut off and things like that. But I do know about maritime law versus common law, so I just want to put that out there. You're not going to, there might be things that I don't know about it because I didn't delve into everything, but it's not like I've never heard about it. And I do know all about the words that we use that are like magician's words with the birth and the birth canal and things like that. So yes, I've seen this stuff. These images have been posted on Facebook recently. It says here, when the ship pulls into the berth, the captain must produce a document of manifest to inform the port authorities of what product he is bringing into the country and the economy. This is the law of the seas. And then when you go into the hospital, the mother's water, of course, is what's there. So you're in the waters, and then you're labeled a maritime admiralty product. Your parents sign a document called a birth certificate. So the birth, same word. Canal, then there's the banks, like a water bank and things like that. There's all sorts of, it's just like a huge subject that you could get into with all the different words that are very, very similar. The English language, I've talked about it beforehand, the English language arts is kind of like a dark arts. It's a magician's way of a language, basically. And so, but I've talked about this before in the past, and I did a video on it about the frequency. It's not about what you say, it's about your frequency. So I am not afraid to say good morning, whereas somebody else finds out that morning and MOURN, morning, like when you mourn for the loss of a friend at a funeral, that they're the same word. And then they would say good morning. It means you're wishing somebody to, mourn some death or something. And it's all in your frequency. If you believe that it's a negative thing, somebody might take it as a curse, if somebody says good morning to you. But if you believe that it's a positive thing, that somebody's wishing you to have a happy morning, daytime, then that's a good thing. It's a blessing. And it really is. So it's all in your frequency. And so I'll leave a link below to that video. And another image that I found online in the same group is this one with the whole, it's illegal to use a legal name, Google legal name fraud today. And I understand that people want to wake others up to some of the deceptions. Like I said, I was praying to not be deceived, and so I was led to research and study this. But I also found that people can get very addicted to it and obsessive about it to the point that it's kind of ridiculous. People actually have spammed my comment section on YouTube videos before with it's illegal to use a legal name fraud. Legal name, sorry, and then talk about legal name fraud afterwards. So they would just go on to people's videos, not even listening to what the person was saying, and they would spread this stuff onto, unrelated videos. And yeah, we can't sort of judge everybody who researches it as spammers, but it really does lead to a sort of an obsessive compulsive behavior where they feel the need to sort of share this information with the world now that they learned it without actually understanding that it was unwanted, I already know, etc., etc. So just something that's interesting that I've sort of come across before. And also this image where it says underneath the man, John, created by the divine, living, breathing being, under divine law, divine jurisdiction, free, private, nonfiction, and then a person, which is in all caps, of course, John Doe, created by the state rather than the divine, a dead entity, under codes and acts instead of divine law, under government jurisdiction, and a slave, and public, and fiction. And of course, you could say they're a corpse, they're a corporation. That's the whole dead part of it. Yes, I know all about that stuff. And then there's some people that claim that you have to be either or. That if you are still writing your name, with all caps, having your name written in all caps, and, expressing that that's you. If a cop comes by and he stops you and they say, is this you? And you say yes, you're saying that you are the all capital person that's that name written on your driver's license rather than a man, who's free. And then they say, do you understand? And that means do you stand under what I'm going to say, etc., etc. And so they're going to say that you can't do that and still be free. You cannot be a person and still be the free man that God created you to be. That's a lie. So I don't really appreciate people going around saying that sort of stuff, but it is what it is. There's good and bad out in the world. And there's going to be people who will take what's there and just sort of go on their obsessive compulsive, off the deep end type interaction with this stuff once they learn it. And then there's those people who would learn about all the, quote unquote magic words, and then they feel like they have to go get themselves a dictionary, which I do believe there is a dictionary out there. I think Carl Lenz might have done that. Maybe it was somebody else. But I do believe there's a dictionary out there with all these different terms. And, you want to understand or comprehend what these terms actually mean because you feel like they have some sort of power over you that, you can't, be free of if you don't understand their terminology, if you don't stop using their spell words, etc. And that's where I disagree with them, especially because of my frequency video, which, like I said, will be linked below. We are free. We were created free. We're still free. We're so free we can choose to be enslaved to things if we choose to be. But we're still free. Of course, I've done many videos about that, on how to be free. So you can be free and still use those words and not be afraid of them. You can still be free and have a license. You can still be free and do whatever you want to do. And, if what you want to do is against the law, then you're free to choose bondage to, if you break the law or whatever. I'll get into that further in a different video or at the very end of this video. But for this video, I just wanted to talk about the fact that I do know of what I speak of, even if I don't believe it's very important as people make it out to be. And I do want to read a little bit of this book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, by Larken, and I'll leave a link below to the book on Amazon if you want to check it out for yourself. Now, I haven't finished it. I really haven't gotten very far in it. But I was reading this, and then these people on Facebook were having this discussion about it, and I just thought, I should probably put my thoughts on the subject up into a video. In order to do that, I kind of have to read what I read in here so you guys understand where I'm coming from as far as that goes, and also where I'm coming from as far as the Bible and things like that. Because I've sort of been on the sidelines listening to both sides of the tale. And like I said, I've studied the admiralty law in the past, in other years, and I've studied the Bible since then, and the law of attraction definitely comes into play in my thoughts of it. So I just kind of want to go through all of it, but I want to read this first, some of this. And like I said, the link will be below if you want to check it out for yourself to get more of it. And yeah, I'll try to maybe get some of the screenshots on the screen so you can see it. I'm going to start at the bottom of page 2. The punchline of this book is easy to express, albeit difficult for most people to accept or even to calmly and rationally contemplate. The belief in authority, which includes all belief in government, in quotes, is irrational and self-contradictory. It is contrary to civilization and morality, and constitutes the most dangerous destructive superstition that has ever existed. Rather than being a force for order and justice, the belief in quote-unquote authority is the arch enemy of humanity. Of course, nearly everyone is raised to believe the exact opposite, that obedience to authority is a virtue, at least in most cases, that respecting and complying with the laws of government is what makes us civilized, and that disrespect for authority leads only to chaos and violence. Obviously, there's a lot of quotes here. You'll see them on the screen. In fact, people have been so thoroughly trained to associate obedience with being good that attacking the concept of authority will sound to most people like suggesting that there is no such thing as right and wrong. No need to abide by any standards of behavior, no need to have any morals at all. That is not what is being advocated here, quite the opposite. Indeed, the reason the myth of authority needs to be demolished is precisely because there is such a thing as right and wrong. It does matter how people treat each other, and people should always strive to live moral lives. Despite the constant authoritarian propaganda claiming otherwise, having respect for authority and having respect for humanity are mutually exclusive and diametrically opposed. The reason to have no respect for the myth of authority is so that we can have respect for humanity and justice. There is a harsh contrast between what we are taught is the purpose of authority, to create a peaceful, civilized society, and the real-world results of authority in action. Flip through any history book, and you will see that most of the injustice and destruction that has occurred throughout the world was not the result of people breaking the law, but rather the result of people obeying and enforcing the laws of various governments. The evils that have been committed in spite of authority are trivial compared to the evils that have been committed in the name of authority. Nevertheless, children are taught that peace and justice come from authoritarian control, and that despite the flagrant evils committed by authoritarian regimes around the world throughout history, they are still morally obligated to respect and obey the current government of their own country. They are taught that doing as you're told is synonymous with being a good person, and that playing by the rules is synonymous with doing the right thing. On the contrary, being a moral person requires taking on the personal responsibility of judging right from wrong and following one's own conscience, the opposite of respecting and obeying authority. The reason it is so important that people understand this fact is that the primary danger posed by the myth of authority is to be found not in the minds of the controllers in government, but in the minds of those being controlled. One nasty individual who loves to dominate others is a trivial threat to humanity unless a lot of other people view such domination as legitimate, because it is achieved via the laws of government. The twisted mind of Adolf Hitler by itself posed little or no threat to humanity. It was the millions of people who viewed Hitler as authority and thus felt obligated to obey his commands and carry out his orders who actually caused the damage done by the Third Reich. In other words, the problem is not that evil people believe in authority. The problem is that basically good people believe in authority, and as a result end up advocating and even committing acts of aggression, injustice, and oppression, even murder. The average statist, one who believes in government, while lamenting all the ways in which authority has been used as a tool for evil, even in his own country, will still insist that it is possible for government to be a force for good, and will still imagine that authority can and must provide the path to peace and justice. People falsely assume that many of the useful and legitimate things that benefit human society require the existence of government. It is good, for example, for people to organize for mutual defense, to work together to achieve common goals, to find ways to cooperate and get along peacefully, to come up with agreements and plans that better allow human beings to exist and thrive in a mutually beneficial and nonviolent state of civilization. But that is not what government is. Despite the fact that governments always claim to be acting on behalf of the people and the common good, the truth is that government, by its very nature, is always in direct opposition to the interests of mankind. Authority is not a noble idea that sometimes goes wrong, nor is it a basically valid concept that sometimes is corrupted. From top to bottom, from start to finish, the very concept of authority itself is anti-human and horribly destructive. Of course, most people will find such an assertion hard to swallow. Isn't government an essential part of human society? Isn't it the mechanism by which civilization is made possible because it forces us imperfect humans to behave in an orderly, peaceful manner? Isn't the enacting of common rules and laws what allows us to get along, to settle disputes in a civilized manner, and to trade and otherwise interact in a fair, nonviolent way? Haven't we always heard that if not for the rule of law and a common respect for authority, we would be no better than a bunch of stupid, violent beasts living in a state of perpetual conflict and chaos? Yes, we have been told that, and no, none of it is true. But trying to disentangle our minds from age-old lies, trying to distill the truth out of a jungle of deeply entrenched falsehoods can be exceedingly difficult, not to mention uncomfortable. In the following pages, the reader will be taken through several stages in order to fully understand why the belief in authority truly is the most dangerous superstition in the history of the world. First, the concept of authority will be distilled down to its most basic essence, so it can be defined and examined objectively. In Part 2, it will be shown that the concept itself is fatally flawed, that the underlying premise of all government is utterly incompatible with logic and morality. In fact, it will be shown that government is purely religious belief, a faith-based acceptance of a superhuman mythological entity that has never existed and will never exist. The reader is not expected to accept such a startling claim without ample evidence and sound reasoning, which will be provided. In Part 3, it will be shown why the belief in authority, including all belief in government, is horrendously dangerous and destructive. Specifically, it will be shown how the belief in authority dramatically impacts both the perceptions and the actions of various categories of people, leading literally billions of otherwise good, peaceful people to condone or commit acts of violent, immoral aggression. In fact, everyone who believes in government does this, though the vast majority do not realize it and would vehemently deny it. Finally, in Part 4, the reader will be given a glimpse into what life without the belief in authority could look like. Contrary to the usual assumption that an absence of government would mean chaos and destruction, it will be shown that when the myth of authority is abandoned, much will change, but much will also stay the same. It will be shown why, rather than the belief in government being conducive to and necessary for a peaceful society, as nearly everyone has been taught, the belief is by far the biggest obstacle to mutually beneficial organization, cooperation, and peaceful coexistence. In short, it will be shown why true civilization can and will exist only after the myth of authority has been eradicated. From early childhood, we are taught to submit to the will of authority, to obey the edicts of those who, in one way or another, have acquired positions of power and control. From the beginning, the goodness of a child is graded, whether explicitly or implicitly, first by how well he obeys his parents, then by how well he obeys his teachers, and then by how well he obeys the laws of government. Whether implied or stated, society is saturated with the message that obedience is a virtue, and that the good people are the ones who do what authority tells them to do. As a result of that message, the concepts of morality and obedience have become so muddled in most people's minds that any attack on the notion of authority will, to most people, feel like an attack on morality itself. Any suggestion that government is inherently illegitimate will sound like suggesting that everyone should behave as uncaring, vicious animals living life by the code of survival of the fittest. The trouble is that the average person's belief system rests upon a hodgepodge of vague, often contradictory concepts and assumptions. Terms such as morality and crime, law and legislation, leaders and citizens are often used by people who have never rationally examined such concepts. To understand the nature of authority and government, we must begin by precisely defining what those terms mean. What is the thing we call government? It is an organization that tells people what to do, but that alone does not provide a complete definition, because all sorts of other individuals and organizations that we do not call government also tell people what to do. Government, however, does not simply suggest or request, it commands. Then again, advertisers and preachers could also be said to give commands, but they are not considered government. Unlike the commands of preachers and advertisers, the commands of government are backed by the threat of punishment, the use of force against those who do not comply. But even that does not give us a complete definition, because street thugs and bullies also enforce their commands, but no one refers to them as government. The distinguishing feature of government is that it is thought to have the moral right to give and enforce commands. Its commands are called laws, and disobeying its commands is called crime. In short, the defining factor which makes something government is the perceived legitimacy and righteousness of the power and control it exerts over others. In other words, its authority. Authority can be summed up as the right to rule. It is not merely the ability to forcibly control others, which to some extent nearly everyone possesses. It is the supposed moral right to forcibly control others. What distinguishes a street gang from government is how they are perceived by the people they control. The trespasses, robbery, extortion, assault, and murder committed by common thugs are perceived by almost everyone as being immoral, unjustified, and criminal. Their victims may comply with their demands, but not out of any feeling of moral obligation to obey, merely out of fear. If the intended victims of the street gang thought they could resist without any danger to themselves, they would do so, without the slightest feeling of guilt. They do not perceive the street thug to be any sort of legitimate rightful ruler. They do not imagine him to be authority. The loot the thug collects is not referred to as taxes, and his threats are not called laws. The commands issued by those who wear the label of government, on the other hand, are perceived very differently by most of those at whom the commands are aimed. Most people perceive the power and control which the lawmakers and government exert over everyone else to be valid and legitimate, legal and good. Most who comply with such commands by obeying the law, and who surrender their money by paying taxes, do not do so merely out of fear of punishment if they disobey, but out of a feeling of duty to obey. No one takes pride in being robbed by a street gang, but many wear the label of law-abiding taxpayer as a badge of honor. This is due entirely to how the obedient perceive the ones giving them commands. If the controllers are perceived as authority, then by definition they are seen as having the moral right to give such commands, which in turn implies a moral obligation on the part of the people to obey those commands. To label oneself a law-abiding taxpayer is to brag about one's loyal obedience to government. In the past, some churches have claimed the right to punish heretics and other sinners, but in the Western world today, the concept of authority is almost always linked to government. In fact, in this day and age, each term implies the other. Authority supposedly derives from the decrees, laws of government, and government is the organization imagined to have the right to rule, i.e., authority. It is essential to differentiate between a command being justified based upon the situation and being justified based upon who gave the command. Only the latter is the type of authority being addressed in this book. though the term is occasionally used in another sense, which tends to muddle this distinction. When, for example, someone asserts that he had the authority to stop a mugger to get an old lady's purse back, or says he had the authority to chase trespassers off his property, he is not claiming to possess any special rights that others do not possess. He is simply saying that he believes that certain situations justify giving orders or using force. In contrast, the concept of government is about certain people having some special right to rule. And that idea, the notion that some people, as a result of elections or other political rituals, for example, have the moral right to control others in situations where most people would not, is the concept being addressed here. Only those in government are thought to have the right to enact laws. Only they are thought to have the right to impose taxes. Only they are thought to have the right to wage wars, to regulate certain matters, to grant licenses for various activities, and so on. When the belief in authority is discussed in this book, that is the meaning being referred to. The idea that some people have the moral right to forcibly control others, and that consequently, those others have the moral obligation to obey. It should be stressed that authority is always in the eye of the beholder. If the one being controlled believes that the one controlling him has the right to do so, then the one being controlled sees the controller as authority. If the one being controlled does not perceive the control to be legitimate, then the controller is not viewed as authority but is seen simply as a bully or a thug. The tentacles of the belief in authority reach into every aspect of human life, but the common denominator is always the perceived legitimacy of the control it exerts over others. Every law and tax, federal, state, and local, every election and campaign, every license and permit, every political debate and movement, in short, everything having to do with government, from a trivial town ordinance to a world war, rests entirely upon the idea that some people have acquired the moral right, in one way or another, to one degree or another, to rule over others. The issue here is not just the misuse of authority or an argument about good government versus bad government, but an examination of the fundamental underlying concept of authority. Whether an authority is seen as absolute or as having conditions or limits upon it may have a bearing of how much damage that authority does, but it has no bearing on whether the underlying concept is rational. The U.S. Constitution, for example, is imagined to have created an authority which, at least in theory, had a severely restricted right to rule. Nonetheless, it still sought to create an authority with the right to do things, e.g., tax and regulate, which the average citizen has no right to do on his own. Though it pretended to give the right to rule only over certain specific matters, it still claimed to bestow some authority upon a ruling class, and as such is just as much a target of the following criticism of authority as the authority of a supreme dictator would be. The term authority is sometimes used in ways that have nothing to do with the topic of this book. For example, one who is an expert in some field is often referred to as an authority. Likewise, some relationships resemble authority, but do not involve any right to rule. The employer-employee relationship is often viewed as if there is a boss and an underling. However, no matter how domineering or overbearing an employer may be, he cannot conscript workers or imprison them for disobedience. The only power he really has is the power to terminate the arrangement by firing the employee, and the employee has the same power because he can quit. The same is true of other relationships that may resemble authority, such as a craftsman and his apprentice, a martial arts sensei and his pupil, or a trainer and the athlete he trains. Some scenarios involve arrangements based upon mutual voluntary agreement, in which either side is free to opt out of the arrangement. Such a relationship where one person voluntarily allows another to direct his actions in hopes that he will benefit from the other's knowledge or skill is not the type of authority that is the subject of this book. Most people believe that government is necessary, though they also acknowledge that authority often leads to corruption and abuse. They know that government can be inefficient, unfair, unreasonable, and oppressive, but they still believe that authority can be a force for good. What they fail to realize is that the problem is not just that government produces inferior results or that authority is often abused. The problem is that the concept itself is utterly irrational and self-contradictory. It is nothing but a superstition, devoid of any logical or evidentiary support. which people hold only as a result of constant cult-like indoctrination designed to hide the logical absurdity of the concept. It is not a matter of degree or how it is used. The truth is that authority does not and cannot exist at all, and failure to recognize that fact has led billions of people to believe things and do things that are horrendously destructive. There can be no such thing as good authority. In fact, there is no such thing as authority at all. As strange as that may sound, it can easily be proven. In short, government does not exist. It never has, and it never will. The politicians are real. The soldiers and police who enforce the politicians' will are real. The buildings they inhabit are real. The weapons they wield are very real. But their supposed authority is not. And without that authority, without the right to do what they do, they are nothing but a gang of thugs. The term government implies legitimacy. It means the exercise of authority over a certain people or place. The way people speak of those in power, calling their commands laws, referring to disobedience to them as a crime, and so on, implies the right of government to rule, and a corresponding obligation on the part of its subjects to obey. Without the right to rule, authority, there is no reason to call the entity government, and all the politicians and their mercenaries become utterly indistinguishable from a giant organized crime syndicate, their laws no more valid than the threats of muggers and carjackers. And that in reality is what every government is, an illegitimate gang of thugs, thieves, and murderers masquerading as a rightful ruling body. The reason the terms government and authority appear inside quotation marks throughout this book is because there is never a legitimate right to rule, so government and authority never actually exist. In this book, such terms refer only to the people and gangs erroneously imagined to have the right to rule. All mainstream political discussion, all debate about what should be legal and illegal, who should be put into power, what national policy should be, how government should handle various issues, all of it is utterly irrational and a complete waste of time, as it is all based upon the false premise that one person can have the right to rule another, that authority can even exist. The entire debate about how authority should be used and what government should do is exactly as useful as debating how Santa Claus should handle Christmas. But it is infinitely more dangerous. On the bright side, removing that danger, the biggest threat that humanity has ever faced, in fact, does not require changing the fundamental nature of man, or converting all hatred to love, or performing all other drastic alteration to the state of the universe. Instead, it requires only that people recognize and then let go of one particular superstition, one irrational lie that almost everyone has been taught to believe. In one sense, most of the world's problems could be solved overnight if everyone did something akin to giving up the belief in Santa Claus. Any idea or proposed solution to a problem that depends upon the existence of government, and that includes absolutely everything within the realm of politics, is inherently invalid. To use an analogy, two people could engage in a useful, rational discussion about whether nuclear power or hydroelectric dams are a better way to produce electricity for their town. But if someone suggested that a better option would be to generate electricity using magic pixie dust, his comments would be and should be dismissed as ridiculous, because real problems cannot be solved by mythical entities. Yet almost all modern discussion of societal problems is nothing but an argument about which type of pixie dust, magic pixie dust, will save humanity. All political discussion rests upon an unquestioned but false assumption, which everyone takes on faith simply because they see and hear everyone else repeating the myth, the notion that there can be such a thing as legitimate government. The problem with popular misconceptions is just that. They are popular. When any belief, even the most ridiculous, illogical belief, is held by most people, it will not feel unreasonable to the believers. Continuing in the belief will feel easy and safe, while questioning it will be uncomfortable and very difficult, if not impossible. Even abundant evidence of the horrendously destructive power of the myth of authority on a nearly incomprehensible level and stretching back for thousands of years has not been enough to make more than a handful of people even begin to question the fundamental concept. And so, Believing themselves to be enlightened and wise, human beings continue to stumble into one colossal disaster after another as a result of their inability to shake off the most dangerous superstition, the belief in authority. There is a large collection of terminology that grows out of the concept of authority. What all such terms have in common is that they imply a certain legitimacy to one group of people forcibly controlling another group. Here are just a few examples. Government. As mentioned before, government is simply the term for the organization or group of people imagined to possess the right to rule. Many other terms describing parts of government, such as president, congressman, judge, and legislature, reinforce the supposed legitimacy of the ruling class. Law. The terms law and legislation have very different connotations from the words threat and command. The difference, again, depends upon whether the ones issuing and imposing such laws are imagined to have the right to do so. If a street gang issues commands to everyone in its neighborhood, no one calls such commands laws. But if government issues commands through the legislative process, nearly everyone calls them laws. In truth, every authoritarian law is a command backed by the threat of retaliation against those who do not comply. Whether it is a law against committing murder or against building a deck without a building permit, it is neither a suggestion nor a request, but a command backed by the threat of violence, whether in the form of forced confiscation of property, i.e. fines, or the kidnapping of a human being, i.e. imprisonment. What might be called extortion if done by the average citizen is called taxation, when done by people who are imagined to have the right to rule. What would normally be seen as harassment, assault, kidnapping, and other offenses are seen as regulation and law enforcement when carried out by those claiming to represent authority. Of course, using the term law to describe the inherent properties of the universe, such as the laws of physics and mathematics, has nothing to do with the concept of authority. Furthermore, there is another concept called natural law, which is very different from statutory law, i.e. legislation. The concept of natural law is that there are standards of right and wrong intrinsic to humanity that do not depend upon any human authority, and that in fact supersede all human authority. Though that concept was the topic of many discussions in the not-too-distant past, it is rare to hear Americans use the term law in such a context today, and that concept is not what is meant by law in this book. Crime. A derivative of the concept of law is the concept of crime. The phrase committing a crime obviously has a negative connotation. The notion that breaking the law is morally wrong implies that the command being disobeyed is inherently legitimate, based solely upon who gave the command. If a street gang tells a store owner, "Give us half of your profits or we will hurt you," no one would consider the store owner a criminal if he resisted such extortion. But if the same demand is made by those wearing the label of government, with the demand being called law and taxes, then the very same store owner would be viewed by almost everyone as a criminal if he refused to comply. The terms crime and criminal do not by themselves even hint at what law is being disobeyed. It is a crime to slowly drive through a red light at an empty intersection, and it is a crime to murder one's neighbors. 100 years ago, it was a crime to teach a slave to read. In 1940s Germany, it was a crime to hide Jews from the SS. In Pennsylvania, it is a crime to sleep in or on top of a refrigerator outside. Literally, committing a crime means disobeying the commands of politicians, and a criminal is anyone who does so. Again, such terms have an obviously negative connotation. Most people do not want to be called a criminal, and they mean it as an insult if they call someone else a criminal. Again, this implies that the authority issuing and enforcing the laws has the right to do so. Lawmakers. There is a strange paradox involved in the concept of lawmakers, in that they are perceived to have the right to give commands, impose taxes, regulate behavior, and otherwise coercively control people, but only if they do so via the legislative process. The people in government legislatures are seen as having the right to rule, but only if they exert their supposed authority by way of certain accepted political rituals. When they do, the lawmakers are then imagined to have the exclusive right to give commands and to hire people to enforce them, a right no other individuals possess. To put it another way, the general public honestly imagines that morality is different for lawmakers than it is for everyone else. Demanding money under the threat of violence is immoral theft when most people do it, but is seen as taxation when politicians do it. Bossing people around and forcibly controlling their actions is seen as harassment, intimidation, and assault when most people do it, but it is seen as regulation and law enforcement when politicians do it. They are called lawmakers rather than threat makers because their commands, if done via certain legislative procedures, are seen as inherently legitimate. In other words, they are seen as authority, and obedience to their legislative commands is seen as a moral imperative. Law enforcement. One of the most common examples of authority, which many people see on a daily basis, wears the label of police or law enforcement. The behavior of law enforcers and the way they are regarded and treated by others shows quite plainly that they are viewed not simply as people, but as representatives of the entity called authority, to which very different standards of morality are believed to apply. Suppose, for example, someone was driving a car without wearing a seatbelt. If another average citizen noticed that and forced the driver to stop and demanded a large sum of money from him, the driver would be outraged. It would be viewed as extortion, harassment, and possibly assault and kidnapping. But when one claiming to act on behalf of government does the exact same thing, by flashing his lights and chasing the person down if he doesn't stop, and then issuing a ticket, such actions are viewed by most as being perfectly legitimate. In a very real sense, the people who wear badges and uniforms are not viewed as mere people by everyone else. They are viewed as the arm of an abstract thing called authority. As a result, the properness of police officer behavior and righteousness of their actions are measured by a far different standard than is the behavior of everyone else. They are judged by how well they enforce the law, rather than by whether their individual actions conform to the normal standards of right and wrong that apply to everyone else. The difference is voiced by the law enforcers themselves, who often defend their actions by saying things such as, "I don't make the law, I just enforce it." Clearly, they expect to be judged only by how faithfully they carry out the will of the lawmakers, rather than by whether they behave like civilized, rational human beings. Countries and nations. The concepts of law and crime are obvious offshoots of the concepts of government and authority, but many other words in the English language are either changed by the belief in authority or exist entirely because of that belief. A country or nation, for example, is a purely political concept. The line around a country is, by definition, the line defining the area over which one particular authority claims the right to rule, which distinguishes that location from the areas over which other authorities claim the right to rule. Geographical locations are, of course, very real, but the term country does not refer only to a place. It always refers to a political jurisdiction, another term stemming from belief in authority. When people speak of loving their country, they are rarely capable of even defining what they mean. But ultimately, the only thing the word country can mean is not the place or the people or any abstract principle or concept, but merely the turf. A certain gang claims the right to rule. In light of that fact, the concept of loving one's country is a rather strange idea. It expresses little more than a psychological attachment to the other subjects who are controlled by the same ruling class, which is not at all what most people envision when they feel national loyalty and patriotism. People may feel love for a certain culture or a certain location and the people who live there, or to some philosophical ideal, and mistake that for love of country. But ultimately, a country is simply the area that a particular government claims the right to rule. That is what defines the borders, and it is those borders which defines the country. People who consider themselves educated, open-minded, and progressive do not want to think of themselves as the slaves of a master, or even the subjects of a ruling class. Because of this, much rationalizing and obfuscating has been done in an attempt to deny the fundamental nature of government as a ruling class. A lot of verbal gymnastics, misleading terminology, and mythology have been manufactured to try to obscure the true relationship between governments and their subjects. This mythology is taught to children as civics, even though most of it is completely illogical and flies in the face of all evidence. The following covers a few of the popular types of propaganda used to obfuscate the nature of authority. The myth of consent. In the modern world, slavery is almost universally condemned, but the relationship of a perceived authority to his subject is very much the relationship of a slave master, owner, to a slave, property. Not wanting to admit that and not wanting to condone what amounts to slavery, those who believe in authority are trained to memorize and repeat blatantly inaccurate rhetoric designed to hide the true nature of the situation. One example of this is the phrase consent of the governed. And there are two basic ways in which people can interact: by mutual agreement, or by one person using threats or violence to force his will upon another. The first can be labeled consent, both sides willingly and voluntarily agreeing to what is to be done. The second can be labeled governing, one person controlling another. Since these two, consent and governing, are opposites, the concept of consent of the governed is a contradiction. If there is mutual consent, it is not government. If there is governing, there is no consent. Some will claim that a majority, or the people as a whole, have given their consent to be ruled, even if many individuals have not. But such an argument turns the concept of consent on its head. No one, individually or as a group, can give consent for something to be done to someone else. That is simply not what consent means. It defies logic to say, I give my consent for you to be robbed. Yet that is the basis of the cult of democracy, the notion that a majority can give consent on behalf of a minority. That is not consent of the governed, it is forcible control of the governed with the consent of a third party. Even if someone were silly enough to actually tell someone else, I agree to let you forcibly control me, the moment the controller must force the controlee to do something, there is obviously no longer consent. Prior to that moment, there is no governing, only voluntary cooperation. Expressing the concept more precisely exposes its inherent schizophrenia. I agree to let you force things upon me, whether I agree to them or not. But in reality, no one ever agrees to let those in government do whatever they want. So, in order to fabricate consent where there is none, believers in authority add another, even more bizarre step to the mythology: the notion of implied consent. The claim is that by merely living in a town or a state or a country, one is agreeing to abide by whatever rules happen to be issued by the people who claim to have the right to rule that town, state, or country. The idea is that if someone does not like the rules, he is free to leave the town, state, or country altogether, and if he chooses not to leave, that constitutes giving his consent to be controlled by the rulers of that jurisdiction. Though it is constantly parroted as a gospel, the idea defies common sense. It makes no more sense than a carjacker stopping a driver on a Sunday and telling him, by driving a car in this neighborhood on Sunday, you are agreeing to give me your car. One person obviously cannot decide what counts as someone else agreeing to something. An agreement is when two or more people communicate a mutual willingness to enter into some agreement. Simply being born somewhere is not agreeing to anything, nor is living in one's own house when some king or politician has declared it to be within the realm he rules. It is one thing for someone to say, if you want to ride in my car, you may not smoke, or you can come into my house only if you take your shoes off. It is quite another to try to tell other people what they can do with their own property. Whoever has the right to make the rules for a particular place is, by definition, the owner of that place. That is the basis of the idea of private property, that there can be an owner who has the exclusive right to decide what is done with and on that property. The owner of a house has the right to keep others out of it, and by extension, the right to tell visitors what they can and cannot do as long as they are in the house. And that sheds some light on the underlying assumption behind the idea of implied consent. To tell someone that his only valid choices are either to leave the country or to abide by whatever commands the politicians issue logically implies that everything in the country is the property of the politicians. If a person can spend year after year paying for his home, or even building it himself, and his choices are still to either obey the politicians or get out, that means that his house and the time and effort he invested in the house are the property of the politicians. And for one person's time and effort to rightfully belong to another is the definition of slavery. That is exactly what the implied consent theory means, that every country is a huge slave plantation, and that everything and everyone there is the property of the politicians, and of course the master does not need the consent of his slave. I'm going to stop here for a second and just discuss something that I had studied over the past few years. Eminent domain is where the country can just decide to take your supposedly private property and use it for public use. And this, of course, would then make whoever owned any property in the United States basically a slave to the owner, which is the United States of America Corporation, that can decide to just take your property whenever it feels like it. This is why I just sort of went underneath the assumption, basically, that everything that we own, we don't really own, because it can be taken away whenever they decide they want to take it. However, in the past year or so, I've come to the conclusion that they have no power over us, even though I do understand that people would argue with me on that. I will explain that later on, continuing on in the book here. Believers in government never explain how it is that a few politicians could have acquired the right to unilaterally claim exclusive ownership of thousands of square miles of land where other people were already living as their territory to rule and exploit as they see fit. It would be no different from a lunatic saying, "I hereby declare North America to be my rightful domain, so anyone living here has to do whatever I say. If you don't like it, you can leave." There is also a practical problem with the obey or get out attitude, which is that getting out would only relocate the individual to some other giant slave plantation on a different country. The end result is that everyone on earth is a slave, with the only choice being which master to live under. This completely rules out actual freedom. More to the point, this is not what consent means. Another aside, of course, I'm going to discuss why I do believe we're free, but that will be later on, continuing on here. The belief that politicians own everything is demonstrated even more dramatically in the concept of immigration laws. The idea that a human being needs permission from politicians to set foot anywhere in an entire country, the notion that it can be a crime for someone to step across an invisible line from one authoritarian jurisdiction into another, implies that the entire country is the property of the ruling class. If a citizen is not allowed to hire an illegal alien, is not allowed to trade with him, is not even allowed to invite an illegal into his own home, then that individual citizen owns nothing, and the politicians own everything. Not only is the theory of implied consent logically flawed, but it also obviously does not describe reality. Any government that had the consent of its subjects would not need and would not have law enforcers. Enforcement happens only if someone does not consent to something. Anyone with their eyes open can see that government on a regular basis does things to a lot of people against their will. To be aware of the myriad of tax collectors, beat cops, inspectors, and regulators, border guards, narcotics agents, prosecutors, judges, soldiers, and all the other mercenaries of the state, and to claim that the government does what it does with the consent of the governed is utterly ridiculous. Each individual, if he is at all honest with himself, knows that those in power do not care whether he consents to abide by their laws. The politician's orders will be carried out by brute force if necessary, with or without any individual's consent. In addition to the myth of the consent of the governed, other political sayings and dogmatic rhetoric are often repeated, despite being completely inaccurate. For example, in the United States, the people are taught, and faithfully repeat, such ideas as "we are the government, and the government works for us, and the government represents us." Such aphorisms are blatantly and obviously untrue, despite the fact that they are constantly parroted by rulers and subjects alike. One of the most bizarre and delusional, but very common claims, is that we the people are the government. School children are taught to repeat this absurdity, even though everyone is fully aware that the politicians issue commands and demands and everyone else either complies or is punished. In the United States, there is a ruling class and a subject class, and the difference between them are many, and obvious. One group commands, the other obeys. One group demands huge sums of money, the other group pays. One group tells the other group where they can live, where they can work, what they can eat, what they can drink, what they can drive, who they can work for, what work they can do, and so on. One group takes and spends trillions of dollars of what the other group earns. One group consists entirely of economic parasites, while the efforts of the other group produce all the wealth. In this system, it is patently obvious who commands and who obeys. The people are not the government by any stretch of the imagination, and it requires profound denial to believe otherwise. But other myths are also used to try to make that lie sound rational. For example, it is also claimed that the government works for us. It is our servant. Again, such a statement does not even remotely match the obvious reality of the situation. It is little more than a cult mantra, a delusion intentionally programmed into the populace in order to twist their view of reality, and most people never even question it. Most never wonder if government works for us. If it is our employee, why does it decide how much we pay it? Why does our employee decide what it will do for us? Why does our employee tell us how to live our lives? Why does our employee demand our obedience for whatever arbitrary commands it issues, sending armed enforcers after us if we disobey? It is impossible for government to ever be the servant because of what government is. To put it simple, personal terms, if someone can boss you around and take your money, he is not your servant, and if he cannot do those things, he is not government. However limited, government is the organization thought to have the right to forcibly control the behavior of its subjects via laws, rendering the popularly accepted rhetoric about public servants completely ridiculous. To imagine that a ruler could ever be the servant of those over whom he rules is patently absurd. Yet that impossibility is spouted as indisputable gospel in civics classes. An even more prevalent lie, used to hide the master-slave relationship between government and the public, is the notion of representative government. The claim is that the people, by electing certain individuals into positions of power, are choosing their leaders, and that those in office are merely representing the will of the people. Again, not only does this claim not at all match reality, but the underlying abstract theory is inherently flawed as well. In the real world, so-called representative governments are constantly doing things their subjects do not want them to do, increasing taxes, engaging in warmongering, selling off power and influence to whoever gives them the most money, and so on. Every taxpayer can easily think of examples of things funded with his money that he objects to. Whether it be handouts to huge corporations, handouts to certain individuals, government actions that infringe on individual rights, or just the overall wasteful, corrupt, inefficient, bureaucratic machine of government. There is no one who can honestly say that the government does everything that he wants and nothing that he does not want. I'm going to stop here and just discuss it. The last part that I read, where it talks about the taxpayers paying for things that they don't want to pay for, obviously is one of the arguments people use for not wanting to pay taxes because of the abortion money. And so this is definitely something that is on people's minds. And of course, war, we all know that we don't want the government to be going to war because our father never wanted anybody to be killing each other. So that's not something that, we want to pay for with our tax money. Although I discussed this previously on my Facebook page, but there is actually something in the Didache, or Didache, however you want to pronounce it, that discusses the early followers of Jesus or Yehoshua and how they went about dealing with giving their money away, basically. And it said that you're supposed to give your money to people who, ask for it, turn the other cheek, etc., render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, that is found throughout the Bible. And in the Didache, it talks about the fact that it's not up to you to decide what that money gets spent on, where that money goes. If somebody's asking for money and they don't deserve money, they don't have a need for money, they are the ones who are going to sort of reap the consequences of what they have sown. And it's not upon you for that. You are just supposed to give when you're asked. and never worry about being the one who gives when you're asked for money. If somebody demands something from you, you give them what they're demanding, and that's fine, because our Father is going to make sure that you get that back, whatever it is. So you don't have to worry about it. And, you're being asked for something, so the blood is on their hands, basically. If they're asking you for taxes, the blood is on their hands. If they don't have a need for it, if they spend it in a poor choice, that's not on you, that's on them. So you don't have to worry about that. You're not supposed to be worried about where your food is going to come from. You're not supposed to be worried about how you're going to pay the rent, etc. As long as you're searching for the kingdom of heaven inside, everything else is going to come to you. So I believe I'll discuss this further in another video, perhaps my live chat tomorrow morning. And I hope you enjoyed this video and the read from the book. The link is in the description box, as I've said before. If you enjoyed this video, you can consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. You can also go to lothealing.com, and on the right-hand side, there's a little place where you can find more contact links for me. Besides Facebook, I'm also on Twitter, Google+, Steemit, MeWe, Minds, Gab.ai, and also Patreon. You can follow me on Patreon for free, but you can also donate if you want to for as little as $1 a month. Everything is appreciated. Have a great day. Chris White once coined the phrase short-term New World Order freakout syndrome to explain what it's like to have your perception of the world shattered. Of course, it's not just about the shape of the world, whether it's flat, round, or something else entirely. This New World Order freakout often includes now saying no to GMOs, fluoride, vaccines, and pharmaceuticals. It's a complete overhaul to your lifestyle. And trying to explain that mainstream media is just propaganda to promote false flags, division, and more can really put a strain on your relationships. Have you gotten tired of being mocked by your own family for what you share? We've all been there. Are you treated like the black sheep because of the commandments you keep? I get it. We're all trying to figure things out together, but sometimes you just have to let your family and friends be. Plant the seed and wait and see. But while you wait for them to catch up, do you wish you had someone to talk with who gets it? That's what Truth or Talk is for. Being able to discuss what's going on in your life and what you're interested in without feeling like you're going to be judged as a crazy conspiracy theorist who should be on drugs or committed. No subject is taboo, and I'd love to hear from you. Simply truthertalk.com. Simply make an appointment, and let's talk, Truther.
Believe is the truth.